Hello, I'm glad you're here, and I hope you're feeling comfortable as you settle in. This will be a slow and gentle journey through the past, told in a calm voice meant to soothe, to steady your thoughts, and to quietly accompany you as you drift toward rest or simply enjoy the soft rhythm of a long historical story. Tonight, we'll wander together through the winding streets, candlelit taverns, echoing halls, and crowded marketplaces of the Middle Ages, exploring a curious phenomenon that swept across the continent, the gambling epidemic of medieval Europe. It is a story of dice and cards and wagers made in the flickering glow of tavern fires, a story of kings who tried to ban the games and peasants who continued to play them, a story of temptation and chance and the human desire to test fate. Let us begin somewhere peaceful, somewhere simple. Imagine a quiet evening in a small medieval village, perhaps in the early 14th century. The sun has already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind only a soft band of violet light along the edge of the sky. The air is cool and smells faintly of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. Most people have retired indoors, gathering around the warmth of a small hearth. But not everyone settles for sleep so quickly. In every village and town, there are those who linger a little longer, who slip into the tavern once their work is done, searching not just for all but for a little excitement at the end of a long day. Inside such a tavern, the wooden shutters rattle lightly in the wind, and the room glows with the golden shimmer of tallow candles. A few travelers hunch over their drinks, while locals exchange quiet words near the fire. At the center of one table, in a patch of light, lies a small pair of bone dice. They are carved from animal bone smoothed by many hands, their dots blackened with soot. Even in a peaceful corner of an ordinary village, these dice carry the weight of centuries of human fascination. Dice were ancient even then. People had been throwing them for thousands of years, long before the medieval world took shape, long before castles rose on hilltops or cathedrals reached toward the sky. In medieval Europe, gambling was not just a pastime but a phenomenon that threaded its way through every layer of society. The wealthy wagered at feasts and tournaments, while the poorest laborers rolled dice in dusty alleys. Soldiers gambled between battles, monks condemned gambling from their pulpits, and kings attempted again and again to outlaw it. Yet, despite every effort to suppress it, the games persisted, slipping through the cracks of society like water through stone. People played in taverns, in marketplaces, behind barns, in quiet corners of castles, and even in the shadows of churches. The rules varied, the stakes differed, but the spirit of taking a chance was everywhere. To understand how deeply gambling embedded itself into medieval life, we need to step back in time and look at the world that surrounded it. Life in medieval Europe was often harsh and uncertain. Harvests failed. Wars erupted without warning. Disease swept through villages. For many people, each day carried its own kind of risk, and so the idea of facing fate by choice, even in a small way, held a strange appeal. A single throw of the dice could bring a brief thrill, a moment of control in a world where control was rare. In the rolling of dice, in the shuffling of cards, in the spinning of a wheel or the drawing of lots, people glimpsed a little spark of possibility. The earliest gambling games in medieval Europe were simple. Dice were the most common tool of chance, and they were easy to make. A craftsman could carve them from bone antler, or even wood. Although bone dice were prized for their durability, there were games of high and low, games that mimicked modern betting, and games where players guessed which number would appear. Some games were quick, played in shadows with hurried hands, while others stretched on through the night as wagers grew higher and tensions rose. Cards appeared later in the Middle Ages, arriving from the East and quickly spreading through Europe. When cards arrived, they added a new layer to gambling culture, introducing images and symbols that felt almost magical to some people, while to others they seemed dangerously tempting. The church was wary of all this. In sermons, priests warned that gambling could corrode the soul, encouraging greed, dishonesty, and idleness. Yet these warnings rarely stopped anyone from playing. Even monks, who lived strict and regimented lives, sometimes fell into betting small tokens with one another in rare moments of leisure. Officially, they were not supposed to, but human beings have always had the capacity to bend rules when curiosity or boredom calls. As gambling spread, authorities became increasingly alarmed. Kings and city councils issued decrees banning dice games, especially among soldiers. They feared that soldiers who gambled would lose their pay, fight among themselves, or neglect their duties. During the 100 Years' War, some commanders tried to forbid the games outright, hoping to maintain discipline, but bans only pushed gambling further into the shadows, and the dice continued to roll behind tents, in barns, and in the dim corners of inns along the roads where armies traveled. In towns, gambling was most often found in taverns. Taverns were gathering places where news was traded, arguments were settled, and games were played. The tavern keeper knew the regulars and kept an ear tuned to everything happening inside. In a warm corner by the hearth, a group of men might be leaning over a rough wooden table, rolling dice with a seriousness that contrasted with the simple tools in their hands. A few coins might be stacked nearby. Sometimes the stakes were small, but other times a player would risk more than he should, and when losses piled up, tempers flared. It was not uncommon for arguments or small fights to break out, though most were quickly calmed by a stern word from the tavern keeper. In wealthier circles, gambling took on a different form. Nobles hosted elaborate feasts that lasted for days. Music played, servants moved gracefully through the hall, and tables groaned under the weight of food. In the glow of torchlight, nobles would gather in side rooms to play games of chance. They wagered jewelry, pieces of clothing, horses, and sometimes entire sums of land or income. A nobleman might enter the night wealthy and leave it burdened by new debts. The thrill of the gamble held a powerful charm, even for those who had everything they needed. In their world of strict etiquette and rigid expectations, gambling offered a fleeting sense of unpredictability. But while the wealthy gambled for entertainment, the poor often gambled out of desperation. A peasant who depended on the harvest might hope that a lucky throw could buy him a needed tool or repay a debt. Gambling became a fragile thread of hope, even though more often it brought disappointment. Villagers would gather in secret spots at the edges of fields, away from the disapproving eyes of local lords. There, with only the moonlight to illuminate the ground, dice clicked softly against the earth. The epidemic nature of gambling came not just from its prevalence, but from the intensity it brought into people's lives. Records from medieval courts show countless disputes over gambling debts. Some people lost everything they owned. A man might pawn his cloak, his tools, or his last coins, convinced that his next throw would change his fortune. Sometimes it did, but more often it led to ruin. In some regions, debt from gambling became so widespread that local authorities were forced to step in, issuing strict rules on how debts could be collected. Yet even that did not stop the games, and so gambling spread further, weaving its way into literature, art, and daily conversation. Medieval poets wrote about gamblers who tempted fate. Artists sketched scenes of people playing dice in shadowy corners. The games became symbols of recklessness in some stories and symbols of daring luck in others. The culture surrounding gambling became rich and layered, revealing human nature in its most hopeful and vulnerable state. As the centuries passed, the games evolved, shaped by changing societies and the shifting tastes of players. When cards arrived, they quickly gained popularity. Each card had meaning, and early decks were hand-painted, making them expensive treasures. Only the wealthy could afford them at first, but over time cards became more common, spreading across Europe. The imagery on the cards reflected the world around them, with kings, knights, fools, and other figures drawn in vivid colors. Playing cards felt almost mystical to some players, and superstition grew around them. People believed certain cards were lucky or cursed, and some believed that fate itself influenced the draw. Even as new games emerged, dice remained the most enduring symbol of medieval gambling. They were simple, portable, and endlessly captivating. The sound of dice striking a wooden table echoed through taverns and inns for centuries. It was a sound that promised possibility, however small. Now, as we continue our long, slow walk through the medieval world, imagine that village tavern once more. The fire has burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The players are tired, their voices soft, their eyes heavy. But still the dice rest in the middle of the table waiting, a small cube of bone, marked with tiny dots, holding within it the unpredictable pattern of fate. As we move forward, imagine traveling from that small village to the bustling streets of a medieval town, where stone walls rise high above narrow lanes, and where every sound seems to echo slightly, as though the city itself were listening. Market stalls line the central square, filled with the smells of spices, cured meats, freshly baked bread, and wool dyed in muted colors. Merchants call out to customers, children chase each other between stalls, and somewhere nearby a church bell rings slowly, marking the hour. In the busy heart of such a town, gambling took on a life of its own. People played openly in some places and covertly in others, depending on the laws of the region. Many towns had specific rules forbidding games on Sundays or near churches, yet these rules were broken with remarkable frequency. You could find men crouched behind barrels, risking what few coins they had, and you could find wealthier merchants wagering on the outcome of long dice games beneath a canopy of cloth, shielded from the rain. Gambling insinuated itself into ordinary life. It happened while people waited for ships to arrive in the harbor, while they paused between unloading wagons, or simply while passing time during a slow evening. Even children imitated the adults, sometimes carving their own tiny dice from scraps of wood. There are medieval accounts of parents being scolded by officials because their children had started skipping chores in order to gamble with the smaller coins intended for household expenses. The concern was not only moral but practical. In societies where every coin counted, gambling could empty pockets faster than anyone expected. Church authorities saw the habits forming and spoke out against them regularly. Priests condemned gambling as a gateway to sin, claiming it fueled anger, envy, and pride. In chapel after chapel, sermons echoed with warnings that games of chance were the work of temptation. But the very intensity of the sermons suggests how little they changed behavior. Whenever something becomes widespread enough for authorities to speak loudly about it, it usually means the practice is deeply rooted. The strange thing is that even those who condemned gambling acknowledged how alluring it could be. The medieval mind was fascinated by chance and by the idea that fate could be tested. Life itself was unpredictable, shaped by storms, illnesses, wars, and unexpected turns of fortune. Against that backdrop, the small, controlled chaos of rolling dice felt like a tiny reflection of the larger world. Some people believed that luck was a sign of divine favor, while others thought it was simply a quirk of the universe. But almost everyone felt the pull of it. This fascination extended into the realms of soldiers and knights. In military camps across Europe, soldiers often gambled in the hours when marching or fighting paused. Archaeologists have found dice carved hastily from bone in places where medieval armies once camped, suggesting that men on the move still found time to play. Commanders repeatedly issued orders forbidding gambling among troops, but the habit persisted. The men played under tents, behind wagons, or in the grass by torchlight. They gambled for coins, bits of food, or small personal possessions. Sometimes the games ended in laughter, and other times they ended in arguments fueled by exhaustion and stress. Yet the games continued, almost as if they offered a brief escape from the harsh reality of military life. The noble courts of medieval Europe were no less affected. At banquets, After the feasting and entertainment, nobles would retreat to side chambers where the tables were cleared and the dice were brought out. They gambled sums far greater than the common people ever saw. They wagered land rights, horses, armor, pieces of jewelry, or even costly fabrics. Some took pride in their skill, believing they could read the movement of the dice or sense a shift in the game's rhythm, though in truth the outcome was always uncertain. The risk was part of the charm, and though nobles lived lives far removed from peasants and soldiers, the desire to test fortune united every class. As gambling continued to grow, city governments began passing increasingly detailed laws. Some towns banned gambling entirely, others restricted the stakes, forbidding wagers above certain amounts. Still others allowed gambling only during certain festivals or holidays. These efforts tell a clear story: gambling had become too abundant to ignore. There were concerns about crime, about fights breaking out, about debts spiraling into conflict. Debts became such an issue in some places that municipal courts were flooded with disputes involving unpaid wages. People argued that they had been cheated, that the dice were loaded, that a card had been placed dishonestly. Judges often refused to honor gambling debts, but by the time the cases reached the courts, the relationships involved were often already strained. In quieter parts of the countryside, gambling sometimes took on a more communal flavor. Villagers might gather by the edge of a field after harvest, relieved that the hardest work had passed. They shared food, drink, and conversation. Then someone would bring out small dice or a crude gambling stick, and a circle would form. In those settings, the stakes were usually modest, but the emotional intensity could still be strong. A man who won might feel a temporary lift in spirits, believing his luck would follow him into the next season. A man who lost might walk home quietly, troubled by the feeling that fate had turned against him. The medieval world was filled with superstitions surrounding luck. People believed that certain objects brought good fortune, such as small stones or tokens carried in clothing. Gamblers whispered charms or made gestures before rolling dice. Some refused to let anyone else touch their dice, fearing it would disrupt their luck. Others believed that dice thrown onto certain surfaces yielded better outcomes. Taverns became places of whispered rituals, where every player had his own habits and beliefs about how to court fortune's favor. As card games spread, new layers of superstition appeared. Some believed the images on the cards held meanings that could influence the outcome. The kings, queens, and knights depicted on the cards were not merely symbols, but hints about the temperament of the game. People developed elaborate interpretations of which cards were lucky, which foretold disaster, and which hinted at a hidden blessing. Even those who claimed not to believe the superstitions found themselves quietly influenced by them. The deeper one looks into medieval gambling, the clearer it becomes that it was far more than a series of games. It was a cultural phenomenon shaped by fear, hope, desire, hardship, and the ever-present uncertainty of medieval life. It was woven into celebrations, into moments of rest, into boredom, into tension, and into gatherings both humble and grand. In a world that often felt unpredictable, the sharp, simple thrill of chance held a powerful allure. As the Middle Ages progressed, the gambling habits of Europe became even more entangled with the shifting rhythms of society. In many regions, the games themselves began to take on distinct local flavors. In Italy, for instance, dice games grew so popular that some cities tried to regulate them as part of public life, issuing decrees not only about when and where people could gamble, but also about the manufacture of dice. There were concerns that dice makers were carving pieces unevenly or weighting them with tiny bits of metal to favor certain numbers. Officials demanded inspections, and some cities kept records of dice confiscated from taverns or private homes. Each example, a quiet testimony to the widespread attempt to influence fate by altering the tools of chance. In German-speaking lands, card games began to flourish as printing techniques slowly advanced. The earliest cards were hand-painted and extremely expensive, but as new methods made it possible to reproduce images on a wider scale, cards became more affordable and spread through taverns and inns. The sound of cards being shuffled joined the familiar clatter of dice on wooden tables. Even the images depicted on those cards reflected the world of their players. Some decks showed kings and nobles dressed in the fashion of the day, while others depicted allegorical scenes or religious figures. Each deck carried the marks of the culture that produced it, turning simple games into small reflections of a society in flux. In France, gambling often appeared alongside music and storytelling. In busy taverns near trade routes, travelers gathered to pass the time while waiting for horses to rest or wagons to be repaired. Musicians played softly in the background, and stories floated through the air, describing distant lands or past battles. Dice games unfolded at nearly every table. Some wagered coins, while others traded small favors or pieces of food. For many, gambling was not merely a risk, but a way to bond with strangers, a way to pass the long hours of travel or work. It made the vast, scattered lands of medieval Europe feel slightly smaller. Meanwhile, in the British Isles, gambling grew so deeply woven into daily life that royal laws became increasingly elaborate. Kings attempted to limit games during times of war, fearing that soldiers and even local militias were becoming too distracted. These attempts rarely succeeded. In fact, some soldiers were so accustomed to gambling that they carried dice in small pouches tied to their belts, worn smooth by constant use. Chronicles from the period describe moments just before battle when men rolled dice on their shields, hoping for a favorable sign. The figures thrown on the dice held no real predictive power, yet in moments of fear and uncertainty, the brief spark of hope mattered greatly. Beyond the public world of taverns and camps, gambling also seeped into more private corners of life. In rural cottages, families gathered by the hearth after long days of labor. While some simply talked or rested, others brought out small homemade dice. These games were played for the simplest of stakes, sometimes nothing more than the satisfaction of victory. But even in such quiet settings, the tension of chance lingered. A farmer might feel his heart beat a little faster when he bet a single coin, knowing it represented hours of work. The thrill was small but unmistakable. As gambling spread, stories naturally followed. Tales circulated about people who won fortunes overnight or lost everything in a single unlucky throw. In many ways, these stories became part of folklore. They were cautionary tales, whispered to children or recounted during long winter evenings. A popular theme involved a gambler who met a mysterious stranger at a crossroads, a stranger who offered him a chance to win beyond his wildest dreams, but demanded something in return. These tales reflected both the allure and the danger of gambling, portraying fate as something that rewarded boldness but punished arrogance. In religious communities, the struggle against gambling grew more complicated. Monasteries and priories tried to maintain strict discipline, but historical accounts reveal that even monks were occasionally reprimanded for betting small tokens during their limited recreation hours. The church understood human nature well enough to know that people were drawn to games of chance, even in the holiest of places. Warnings were issued, penances were assigned, and rules were reinforced. Yet each new rule indicated that the habit had once again crept across boundaries meant to contain it. The economic consequences of widespread gambling became increasingly noticeable over time. Local economies in many regions relied on careful management of resources. When individuals lost money through gambling, it affected not only their families, but also the broader community. A merchant who gambled away his earnings could no longer pay suppliers. A laborer who lost wages might struggle to afford basic necessities. In some towns, councils quietly acknowledged how disruptive this could be. They encouraged tavern keepers to monitor games, though such measures were often ineffective. Profit was profit, and taverns relied on patrons who came not only for all, but also for the excitement of testing their luck. Despite the difficulties it caused, gambling persisted for centuries, deeply embedded in social life. Its endurance revealed something profound about the medieval world. People lived with uncertainty every day, shaped by forces they could not control. Gambling offered them a strange and fleeting sense of agency. For a moment, they could choose their wager, make their throw, and watch fate unfold before them in a controlled space. It was a small rebellion against the unpredictability of life, a way to feel a brief spark of possibility even in difficult times. In the quiet villages of northern France, life in the 14th century was structured by the seasons, by the rhythm of the harvest, and by the constant awareness of survival. Yet even in these small communities, the practice of gambling carved out a small but significant place in daily existence. On evenings when the fields had been cleared and the laborers had returned from the long work of plowing or gathering grain, villagers would gather in homes with larger fireplaces, huddling around tables carved roughly from local timber. Children often sat nearby, quietly observing, sometimes learning the gestures and counting methods that adults used to play simple dice games. The dice themselves were often rudimentary, hand-carved cubes of bone or wood with uneven markings. But their simplicity belied the intensity of the experience. Each roll carried stakes that, though small by modern standards, represented hours of labor, a meal, or the last coins a family possessed. In these same villages, gossip about gambling success or failure traveled quickly. A man who had won a particularly daring wager would find his story repeated from home to home, sometimes embellished with a supernatural twist, claiming luck had favored him because of divine blessing or secret skill. Similarly, a man who lost heavily might face quiet ridicule, though not openly, as misfortune was considered an unlucky but human circumstance. Over time, these small narratives formed an oral tradition surrounding gambling. They reinforced its cultural presence, ensuring that even those who did not participate understood the allure and the risk. Moving southward to Italy, cities such as Florence and Venice experienced a different expression of gambling culture. Here, trade routes brought merchants into contact with cultures from the East, introducing card games, new dice variations, and the concept of more elaborate wagering systems. Cards were initially a luxury item, hand-painted and expensive, accessible only to the wealthy, but their imagery fascinated all who saw them. Nobles and merchants alike were drawn to the intrigue they presented, both for the entertainment of play and the opportunity to display status. At private gatherings, lavishly appointed rooms with tapestries on the walls would host games of cards alongside discussions of business and politics. The stakes were often high silver coins, land leases, or even the promise of future business favors. The act of gambling became intertwined with negotiation and social maneuvering, an intricate dance in which skill, luck, and perception all played a role. In Germany, a similar cultural penetration occurred, but with notable differences shaped by local governance and social structure. Town councils issued specific ordinances concerning dice and card games, sometimes establishing official inspectors to oversee games in public houses. These laws frequently attempted to regulate both the stakes and the timing of games. For example, games were often prohibited during holy days or market days, when attention was required for religious observance or commerce. Despite these measures, records show that games continued in secret corners, behind tavern counters, and in private homes. Archaeological evidence, such as bone dice discovered beneath floorboards or in refuse pits, suggests that the games were played persistently, almost as a ritual passed from one generation to the next. The persistence of gambling despite regulation illustrates the deep human need for controlled risk, a temporary escape from the daily demands of life. The British Isles present yet another variation on the theme. In England and Scotland, gambling had become so embedded by the 15th century that the Crown frequently intervened, particularly when soldiers, knights, or even common laborers placed wagers that interfered with military readiness or civil order. Court records from the period show disputes arising from unpaid gambling debts, sometimes escalating into accusations of theft or violence. Laws frequently punished offenders not merely for losing, but for defying social norms of fairness and honesty. Soldiers, however, continued to gamble, often carrying sets of dice sewn into leather pouches at their belts. During campaigns, dice games offered soldiers a brief reprieve from the anxiety of battle. Chronicles recount moments when men paused on the eve of skirmishes to roll dice, reading omens into the patterns of the throws. Though these acts could seem reckless, they were understood by participants as small rituals of psychological preparation, a means of asserting a sliver of control in a world dominated by chance. In Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, the story of gambling intertwined with both Moorish influence and Christian reconquest. Public spaces often hosted informal games, and private households kept dice or playing cards on hand for quiet entertainment. Nobility and royalty in Spain, like their counterparts in Italy, wagered lavishly during formal feasts, often using gaming as a tool to cement alliances or to measure the character and judgment of guests. While gambling among the lower classes was common, among the elite it carried a symbolic significance. Success at a game could enhance prestige and indicate intelligence or cunning, while repeated losses could be a subtle social signal of imprudence. In this way, gambling was simultaneously recreational and a marker of social status. Throughout all regions of Europe, the Church remained an omnipresent voice, simultaneously condemning the vice of gambling and acknowledging its ubiquity. Sermons, letters, and church councils repeatedly addressed the subject. Some clerics were particularly severe, equating gambling with greed, idleness, and moral corruption. Others approached it more pragmatically, recognizing that attempts to eradicate gambling entirely were futile. They often focused on moderation, urging parishioners to keep stakes low, play only in certain spaces, or avoid games during times of religious observance. Yet, even the clergy could not prevent the social momentum of gambling. In some cases, monks and priests were themselves observed engaging in small bets, sometimes over games of dice played quietly in private quarters. These instances highlight the powerful allure of chance, even among those most committed to restraint and moral discipline. Gambling also intersected with seasonal festivals and celebrations, which often provided the socially acceptable occasion for higher stakes and more public participation. Harvest festivals, saints' days, and local fairs became venues for gambling as much as for trade or performance. Traveling entertainers, musicians, and acrobats would set up alongside temporary stalls and games of chance. Dice games might be arranged for spectators as much as participants, with coins and small tokens exchanged freely in a carnival atmosphere. Here, gambling functioned as both entertainment and social glue, binding together a community in shared excitement, suspense, and occasional disappointment. The sounds of dice clattering, coins dropping, and players exclaiming their fortunes became an ambient soundtrack to life's rhythms. In addition to the public and elite spheres, private gambling took on a significant role in the domestic environment. Families, particularly in wealthier households, sometimes engaged in card games or dice games during long evenings or inclement weather. The nature of stakes was often symbolic, such as small favors, pieces of fabric, or household goods. The act of playing together reinforced familial bonds, created informal hierarchies, and allowed for the transmission of strategies, superstitions, and customs. In rural households, even very small villages had informal networks of players who shared games in rotation, traveling from one cottage to the next, so that a culture of chance remained alive even in isolation. Stories of individuals also illustrate the personal dimensions of gambling. Chroniclers describe men and women whose fortunes rose and fell dramatically due to games of chance. There were nobles who gambled away entire estates in a single night, soldiers who lost their pay and risked desertion, merchants who ruined years of savings, and common folk who risked their simple possessions. Some of these individuals became local legends, cautionary figures whose names and deeds were repeated for generations. Others became exemplars of luck and ingenuity, remembered for the rare nights when skill, intuition, or mere fortune allowed them to turn a few coins into a remarkable gain. The mixture of success and ruin reinforced the moral narratives associated with gambling, embedding lessons about luck, prudence, and human folly into cultural consciousness. Superstition and ritual were closely tied to the practice. People believed that dice, cards, or other tools could carry influence beyond simple mathematics. Certain objects were considered lucky or unlucky, and gestures before rolling dice were thought to sway outcomes. Players might avoid particular numbers, use tokens to draw favor, or recite brief prayers to seek protection from misfortune. These beliefs reflected a broader medieval worldview in which chance and fate were intertwined with the divine, the natural world, and human intention. Even those who did not hold explicit religious beliefs often observed these rituals, whether out of caution, habit, or the thrill of participating in shared cultural practices. The persistence of gambling over centuries was remarkable not only for its ubiquity, but for the way it shaped social and economic networks. Taverns, inns, and public spaces became gathering points not just for casual interaction, but for economic exchange, political discussion, and news dissemination. Those who frequented gambling spaces formed relationships based on trust, reputation, and mutual risk. Even when games were ostensibly casual, they facilitated the circulation of information and the negotiation of social hierarchies. A person who consistently won might gain social prestige, while a habitual loser could find their standing diminished. In this way, gambling became a subtle mechanism for structuring community life. As Europe moved toward the late medieval period, the proliferation of printed materials contributed to the evolution of games and gambling culture. Instruction manuals, early pamphlets, and illustrated guides circulated in urban centers, spreading new techniques, rules, and ideas about games. The printed word made certain games more standardized, introduced new variations, and allowed trends to travel across regions. People could learn new strategies, debate the merits of particular tactics, and compare outcomes, expanding the shared cultural framework around gambling. This intellectual dimension of chance added yet another layer to the phenomenon, linking play with thought, strategy, and social discourse. The impact of the gambling epidemic was also visible in legal and political contexts. Municipal records are filled with cases involving unpaid wages, disputes over fairness, and conflicts resulting from gambling-related debt. Kings and rulers issued repeated edicts attempting to curb public games, often motivated by concern over order, taxation, and military discipline. While enforcement was uneven, the existence of these records underscores the significant social and economic impact of gambling. In some towns, officials monitored taverns, regulated the stakes, and even confiscated dice or cards to prevent large-scale losses. Despite these interventions, the culture of gambling proved resilient, adapting to new rules and persisting across social strata. Across Europe, the phenomenon of gambling influenced art, literature, and storytelling. Scenes of dice games appeared in tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and paintings, sometimes depicting leisure, sometimes warning of vice. Writers and chroniclers recounted stories of gamblers who lost everything or who won against impossible odds, embedding the practice into cultural memory. These narratives reflected both the thrill and the danger of chance, reinforcing social norms while celebrating ingenuity, daring, and the human desire to test fortune. The pervasive nature of gambling in medieval Europe reached even the most remote corners of society, embedding itself into everyday life, culture, and the very structure of communities. In the quiet, thatched roof villages tucked into valleys and along rivers, gambling was often part of the rhythm of labor and leisure. Life in these communities revolved around work tending animals, harvesting crops, mending tools, and preparing for the changing seasons. Even in such a demanding context, the allure of chance proved irresistible. After a long day, villagers gathered by the warmth of a fire in a common room or the largest home in the settlement. There, the tossing of dice or the playing of simple card games allowed people a temporary reprieve from toil and uncertainty. These gatherings were never purely recreational. They were social hubs where relationships were reinforced, alliances were subtly negotiated, and hierarchy was both acknowledged and contested. A skilled gambler, even among common folk, could acquire a measure of prestige, not because of wealth alone, but because their ability to navigate the uncertain odds reflected sharp observation, patience, and a kind of intuitive intelligence. Conversely, those who consistently lost or were caught cheating risked shame, ostracism, or, in more extreme cases, legal repercussions. Gambling, in this sense, acted as both a social equalizer and a mirror of human ambition. In larger towns and burgeoning cities, the phenomenon became more complex. Urban life, with its crowded streets, bustling markets, and dense population, offered both opportunity and anonymity. Gamblers could take advantage of the presence of strangers to play openly without immediate social consequences, while also relying on networks of acquaintances to maintain the continuity of local games. Taverns became a key institutional space in this system. They provided warmth, food, drink, and most importantly, a semi-public yet private environment where games could unfold. The tavern keeper often functioned as an informal regulator, observing games, monitoring stakes, and occasionally intervening in disputes, while at the same time profiting from the increased patronage generated by the players' enthusiasm. The architectural and material culture of the period also played a role. Dice were typically carved from bone or wood, sometimes inscribed with simple dots or more elaborate markings. Cards, when they appeared, were initially rare and costly. They were hand-painted and richly illustrated, often serving as objects of prestige as well as instruments of play. People treated these objects with care, and in some cases, superstition infused their use. A particular die might be considered lucky, or a specific card might be thought to carry a protective charm. The act of playing thus involved not only chance but belief, ritual, and cultural knowledge, creating an intricate web of meanings and practices around what might otherwise seem a simple pastime. The Church's response to gambling was multifaceted and persistent. Clerics across Europe issued repeated warnings, equating games of chance with moral decay. They argued that gambling encouraged covetousness, promoted dishonesty, and distracted people from their duties to family, community, and faith. Church councils debated measures to curb the activity, sometimes proposing severe penalties for offenders. Nevertheless, historical records indicate that enforcement was uneven and often ineffective. Many parishioners ignored the warnings, and even some members of the clergy participated privately in dice games or betting, highlighting the deep human attraction to the uncertain and the forbidden. Military life provided another dimension to the spread of gambling. Soldiers faced enormous risks on a daily basis: the threat of injury or death, the uncertainty of supply lines, the unpredictability of weather and terrain. In such a context, gambling offered a structured form of chance, a controlled outlet for the anxieties of survival. Soldiers rolled dice or played card games during pauses in campaigns, using the results as a means of psychological preparation or as simple entertainment. Accounts from chroniclers and preserved military correspondence indicate that this practice was widespread, and commanders often struggled to balance discipline with acknowledgement of the human need for diversion. Dice games became a constant companion to soldiers on march and in camp, reinforcing camaraderie and, occasionally, rivalry. Among the nobility, gambling reflected both leisure and power. At feasts and court gatherings, nobles wagered not only coins but entire properties or privileges. The act of gambling in these contexts was a mixture of entertainment, social signaling, and strategic interaction. A skilled player could demonstrate cleverness, cunning, or courage, while a poor showing could indicate recklessness or inattention. Gambling thus functioned as a subtle instrument of social negotiation, reinforcing hierarchies while offering a temporary inversion of expectations. Even kings occasionally engaged in games of chance, balancing enjoyment with the necessity of public propriety. The spread of gambling across Europe was also influenced by cultural exchange and trade. Italy, Spain, France, and the Low Countries all received influences from the East, bringing new games, rules, and objects. The introduction of card games from Islamic regions and the East through trade networks transformed the landscape of European gambling. These cards were initially rare and costly, but over time, they became increasingly accessible. Illustrations on the cards reflected both the social hierarchies and the values of the regions that produced them, further embedding the games within local culture. The images were not only decorative but carried meaning and symbolism, which players interpreted and incorporated into their understanding of chance, luck, and skill. Economic implications of gambling were significant. Small wagers might affect personal finances, while larger ones could ripple through local economies. Merchants who lost capital in bets might be unable to settle debts, impacting suppliers and laborers. Workers who gambled away earnings risked food insecurity or the inability to meet rent obligations. In some towns, municipal authorities responded by attempting to regulate gambling through licensing, rules on stakes, and the monitoring of public games. These interventions varied in success, as human desire for chance and risk often outweighed regulatory oversight. Gambling also left its mark on culture and literature. Chroniclers, poets, and artists incorporated themes of chance and risk into their work. Tales of fortune and misfortune, clever strategy and audacious risk were common in manuscripts and oral storytelling. These narratives reflected the complex social and moral dimensions of gambling. A man who won unexpectedly might be celebrated as clever or blessed, while repeated losses might be depicted as the inevitable consequence of moral weakness or hubris. In this way, the act of playing dice or cards became enmeshed in cultural narratives about fate, fortune, and human character. Regional variation also played a role in shaping the culture of gambling. In northern regions, dice games dominated due to their simplicity and portability. In southern regions, where wealth and trade were more concentrated, card games became increasingly prominent. Even within these regions, local customs dictated how games were played, what stakes were considered acceptable, and how disputes were resolved. In some areas, gambling was tightly bound to festivals, holidays, or market days, while in others, it was a quiet, ongoing activity. These variations reflect the adaptability of gambling as a practice, capable of existing in multiple social, economic, and cultural contexts simultaneously. The social consequences of gambling were profound. Individuals who lost heavily often faced strained relationships, as family and friends bore the consequences of their misfortune. Repeated gambling losses could lead to debt, social ostracism, or even legal action. Communities sometimes attempted to mitigate these effects through local ordinances or informal social pressure, yet the pull of chance remained strong. Winning could elevate a person's social standing, even temporarily, while losing carried both material and reputational costs. The dynamic created a continuous tension, blending excitement and anxiety into a shared human experience that spanned classes and regions. As European society moved toward the late medieval period, printing and the spread of literacy introduced new ways of thinking about games of chance. Printed materials described rules, strategies, and variations of existing games, allowing knowledge to circulate more widely. This dissemination contributed to standardization of rules, the development of new variations, and the growing sophistication of players. Knowledge about probabilities, patterns, and strategy began to emerge, though always intertwined with superstition and belief in luck. Players developed rituals, interpretations, and practices to manage the uncertainty inherent in games, blending observation, intuition, and cultural belief. In addition to formal and informal play, gambling was often embedded in storytelling, theater, and performance. Traveling entertainers included games as part of their acts, using chance to engage audiences. Fortune telling, card reading, and dice prediction were common entertainments. These practices blurred the line between play and spectacle, allowing gambling to enter both private and public cultural life. Spectators learned from observing players, noting techniques, habits, and superstitions, further reinforcing the social transmission of gambling culture. Throughout Europe, the combination of economic necessity, social interaction, psychological stimulation, and cultural reinforcement ensured that gambling remained persistent and influential. It shaped relationships, informed social hierarchies, and influenced the rhythms of daily life. From peasants to nobles, soldiers to merchants, the pursuit of chance became a constant companion, reflecting both the uncertainties of medieval existence and the human desire to confront them, however briefly, on one's own terms. As the years passed, gambling in medieval Europe became increasingly sophisticated, layered with nuance, social meaning, and regional variation. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the proliferation of taverns, inns, and public spaces facilitated a new scale of gaming culture. These locations were no longer merely places to eat, drink, or rest. They were social centers where games of chance intertwined with commerce, conversation, and community life. The sounds of clattering dice, shuffled cards, and murmured wagers filled the air, creating a backdrop to everyday activity. These spaces allowed people of various classes to gather, not merely as neighbors but as participants in a shared, ritualized engagement with risk. In rural communities, gambling remained tightly interwoven with seasonal cycles. During harvest, winter preparations, or festivals, villagers gathered in communal halls, barns, or even open-air spaces to play games of chance. While stakes were often modest, a coin, a loaf of bread, or the promise of future help, the emotional stakes were high. Winning and losing affected social relationships as much as material possessions. A man who consistently won might gain respect, admiration, or even envy, while a man who lost frequently could face quiet disapproval or social isolation. These dynamics made gambling not only a pastime, but also a subtle means of negotiating hierarchy and reputation within tight-knit communities. Urban centers offered a different environment. Cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, and London had denser populations, wealthier residents, and more complex social structures. In these places, gambling became both a leisure activity and a form of social signaling. Noble families would host private games in their residences, often after lavish feasts, wagering sums far beyond the means of ordinary citizens. For these players, gambling was about more than winning or losing. It was a demonstration of wit, courage, and social acumen. Cards, which had arrived from the East via trade networks, became a central element in these games. Hand-painted decks were prized possessions, and the symbolism embedded in the cards, kings, queens, knaves, and allegorical figures, added layers of meaning and strategy. A player's skill was judged not only by success, but by the ability to read the symbolism, predict outcomes, and manipulate circumstances to advantage. The interplay between regulation and persistence was a defining feature of gambling culture. Authorities at multiple levels, kings, city councils, and local magistrates, issued repeated decrees attempting to curb excessive play. Soldiers were often prohibited from gambling, merchants were restricted in stake amounts, and public games were sometimes banned during religious observances. Despite these interventions, games continued, frequently moving into less visible spaces. Historians note that enforcement often failed because gambling was deeply rooted in human behavior. The allure of chance, the excitement of risk, and the social rewards of skill or luck outweighed the fear of punishment. In some regions, Authorities simply acknowledged the persistence of the activity and attempted to regulate it pragmatically, setting limits rather than attempting to eradicate it entirely. The social dimension of gambling extended to families as well. In wealthier households, games were played in domestic settings as part of leisure activities, often during long evenings or inclement weather. Stakes were symbolic, a token coin, a piece of fabric, or household favors. Yet these seemingly minor games carried subtle social lessons. Children observed adults, learning rules, techniques, and the social etiquette of play. They absorbed the moral narratives associated with success and failure, the rituals of luck and superstition, and the strategies of negotiation and bluff. In rural settings, these games often formed networks of rotating gatherings. A family might host a small group of players for a week, after which the games moved to another household, ensuring the continuity of local gambling culture. Even in geographically dispersed communities, the psychological dimensions of gambling were significant. For peasants, soldiers, merchants, and nobles alike, gambling provided a structured form of risk within an otherwise uncertain world. Medieval life was fraught with unpredictability, crop failures, disease outbreaks, economic instability, and violent conflict. Gambling offered a controlled simulation of these uncertainties, a moment in which individuals could confront chance and potentially assert mastery over it. Even when losses occurred, the act of playing fulfilled a psychological need for engagement with uncertainty and the temporary experience of control. In many ways, gambling functioned as a coping mechanism, a social lubricant, and a form of entertainment all at once. The cultural resonance of gambling extended into folklore, literature, and visual art. Chroniclers and poets recounted stories of gamblers who achieved remarkable fortune or suffered devastating loss, often casting these narratives as moral lessons or cautionary tales. In illuminated manuscripts and tapestries, scenes of dice games and card play depicted both leisure and folly, illustrating the complex interplay between chance, skill, and human desire. Artisans and storytellers captured the drama, suspense, and ritual of play, embedding gambling into the broader fabric of medieval culture. In this sense, gambling was not simply a pastime but a lens through which society explored questions of fate, morality, and human nature. Regional differences shaped the evolution of games themselves. In Northern Europe, dice remained predominant, favored for their simplicity and portability. In Southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain, card games flourished, reflecting wealth, trade networks, and cultural sophistication. Within each region, local customs dictated acceptable stakes, permissible locations, and methods of adjudicating disputes. In some areas, gambling was strictly regulated and integrated into civic life. In others, it remained an informal, often clandestine activity. The adaptability of gambling ensured that it could persist across varying social, economic, and cultural contexts, evolving in response to both opportunity and constraint. Economic consequences were significant. Gambling affected not only individuals, but also communities and local economies. A merchant who lost a substantial sum might be unable to settle debts with suppliers, creating a ripple effect that impacted trade and labor. A peasant who lost wages risked food insecurity or the inability to pay rent. Municipal authorities in some towns responded with regulatory measures, licensing systems, and oversight of public games, though enforcement varied in effectiveness. In practice, the culture of gambling proved resilient. Even strict rules often led to games moving into less observable spaces, highlighting the human desire to engage with risk and chance. The superstitious and ritualistic elements of gambling played a central role in its persistence. Players often carried charms, recited brief prayers, or performed gestures intended to influence outcomes. Certain dice were considered lucky, and some cards or tokens were believed to hold special power. These practices reflected broader medieval understandings of the world, in which chance, divine influence, and natural law were intertwined. The ritualization of gambling enhanced the experience, providing a framework for interpreting success and failure and creating a shared cultural vocabulary around risk, luck, and fortune. Soldiers, too, demonstrated the psychological and social significance of gambling. Military life was inherently uncertain, marked by long marches, precarious supply lines, and the constant threat of combat. Dice games and card play offered soldiers a measure of psychological relief and a structured way to confront uncertainty. Games were often communal, fostering camaraderie, trust, and friendly competition. Accounts from campaign records indicate that soldiers frequently carried personal sets of dice or small decks of cards, emphasizing the centrality of play even amidst the rigors of military duty. Commanders often struggled to balance enforcement with recognition of the morale and cohesion benefits that these games provided. In noble and royal circles, gambling operated as both entertainment and social strategy. During feasts and private gatherings, nobles wagered not only money but property, privileges, or social influence. Skill in play could enhance prestige, while poor performance could subtly signal imprudence or lack of acumen. Gambling was thus a form of social currency, reflecting intelligence, foresight, and boldness. The stakes, rituals, and etiquette surrounding these games were highly codified, emphasizing the symbolic as much as the material consequences. Cards, when introduced, enhanced this sophistication, with imagery providing opportunities for interpretation, prediction, and social signaling. Gambling also intersected with seasonal festivals, religious observances, and public celebrations. Market days, harvest festivals, and saints' days often included games of chance as part of communal gatherings. Traveling entertainers and merchants integrated games into their performances, blending amusement with instruction and social commentary. Spectators could participate vicariously, observing outcomes, learning strategies, and absorbing the excitement of chance. These events contributed to the normalization and persistence of gambling as a central element of medieval social life. The spread of printed materials in the late medieval period further influenced gambling. Instruction manuals, pamphlets, and illustrated guides circulated knowledge about games, rules, and strategies. Standardization allowed for more sophisticated play, the exchange of ideas, and the development of regional variations. Knowledge of probabilities, tactics, and superstitions traveled alongside the physical objects of play, enhancing the intellectual dimensions of gambling. Players developed increasingly elaborate rituals, integrating observation, experience, and belief into their strategies. Across Europe, gambling persisted as a multi-faceted phenomenon embedded in social, economic, and cultural life. Its impact was profound. It shaped personal relationships, reinforced hierarchies, and influenced the rhythm of daily existence. From rural cottages to urban taverns, from noble courts to military camps, people of all classes engaged with risk, chance, and fortune. Through dice and cards, through ritual and superstition, through oral and written stories, gambling became a defining feature of medieval Europe, illustrating both the pleasures and perils of human interaction with uncertainty. As gambling continued to permeate medieval Europe, it became a phenomenon that touched nearly every aspect of life, from social rituals to economic systems, and from moral philosophy to superstition. One striking feature of the gambling epidemic was its ability to adapt to and reflect the broader cultural and social conditions of the time. It was not merely an isolated vice or pastime. It was a mirror of medieval society's preoccupations, anxieties, and desires. To understand the full scope of this phenomenon, one must examine the ways gambling intersected with work, leisure, religion, social hierarchy, law, and belief systems. In agrarian communities, gambling often emerged naturally as a way to fill long periods of waiting. The rhythm of medieval agricultural life was dictated by the seasons. During planting or harvesting, there was little time for recreation. But after the work was complete, evenings stretched long and quiet. Villagers gathered around the hearth, bringing out whatever dice, sticks, or cards they possessed. These sessions were often social as well as recreational. They allowed families and neighbors to share news, tell stories, and reinforce communal bonds. Winning or losing was always secondary to the experience itself, yet even small stakes could carry significant weight in a world where every coin and loaf of bread mattered. The emotional intensity of these gatherings reinforced gambling's presence as an enduring aspect of social life. The influence of gambling on urban economies was another remarkable feature of the epidemic. Cities and towns, particularly in regions such as northern Italy, the Low Countries, and southern Germany, had dense populations and vibrant trade networks. Merchants, craftsmen, and laborers mingled in public spaces where games of chance were readily available. Inns and taverns became micro-economies themselves, profiting not only from food and drink, but from the energy and excitement that gambling brought into the space. The practice also influenced local markets indirectly. Coins spent or lost in games might later be used in trade, shifting economic resources in ways that were subtle but persistent. In some cases, local authorities taxed games or monitored winnings, acknowledging gambling as an unavoidable but controllable part of urban life. Gambling also intersected with social hierarchy in nuanced ways. Among the nobility, games of chance were a measure of wit, courage, and prudence. Noblemen often wagered valuable items, including horses, jewelry, or even rights to land. While these games were ostensibly for entertainment, they carried profound social and political significance. Success at a high-stakes game could enhance a person's reputation, demonstrating intelligence, foresight, and composure. Conversely, repeated losses might suggest imprudence or lack of judgment, subtly affecting a noble's social standing. These games were carefully observed by peers who interpreted behavior and outcomes as indicators of character and capacity. In this sense, gambling functioned as a form of social calibration, reinforcing hierarchies while offering opportunities for subtle subversion or display of skill. Religious institutions engaged in a complex relationship with gambling. Church authorities consistently condemned the practice, associating it with moral decay, idleness, and greed. Sermons and edicts warned against the temptation of chance, emphasizing the dangers of obsession and financial ruin. Monastic orders sought to prevent gambling among monks, yet records indicate that some participated in small bets privately, often during periods of rest or recreation. The persistence of gambling, despite religious censure, demonstrates the deep human attraction to chance and the limited power of moral admonition alone to suppress it. Moreover, the Church's nuanced stance, sometimes allowing minor games under controlled circumstances, reflects the difficulty of enforcing moral ideals against culturally entrenched practices. Superstition and ritual played a central role in medieval gambling culture. Players often carried charms, invoked prayers, or performed gestures to influence outcomes. Dice were frequently considered lucky or unlucky, and players were attentive to patterns, signs, and omens. Cards, when introduced, carried symbolic significance, with imagery interpreted as indicators of fortune or divine favor. These practices reveal that gambling was not merely a material or recreational activity, but a complex cultural practice involving belief, psychology, and social interpretation. Ritualized behavior enhanced the experience, providing a framework to understand success, failure, and the unpredictable forces that govern daily life. Military life offers another dimension of the gambling epidemic. Soldiers faced constant uncertainty, from the outcome of battles to the availability of provisions. Dice and card games offered structured engagement with chance, a temporary reprieve from danger, and a way to manage anxiety. Games were often social, strengthening camaraderie among troops, yet they also reflected hierarchical structures. Officers sometimes monitored or controlled games to maintain discipline, while enlisted men used games as a means of negotiation, entertainment, and psychological coping. Campaigns and encampments across Europe produced numerous accounts of gambling, highlighting its persistence even under conditions of extreme hardship. The moral, psychological, and economic impact of gambling extended across classes. Merchants and laborers risked earnings, peasants wagered food and tools, and nobles gambled with property and social influence. Stories of ruin and fortune circulated widely, reinforcing both cautionary and aspirational narratives. In literature and oral storytelling, gamblers were portrayed as heroes, fools, or cautionary figures, illustrating the moral and social lessons embedded in games of chance. Artifacts, manuscripts, and tapestries also depict gambling, sometimes in the context of leisure, sometimes as a warning against vice. These depictions reflect the deep integration of gambling into cultural consciousness and its significance as a lens through which medieval society interpreted human behavior. Regional variations influence the types of games played, the rules enforced, and the social context of gambling. Northern Europe favored dice due to their simplicity, portability, and durability. Southern Europe embraced card games, which reflected wealth, artistic sensibility, and the symbolic sophistication of social elites. Festivals, market days, and religious observances provided opportunities for both public and private gambling, further embedding the practice into communal life. Despite regulation, games persisted, often adapting to social and legal constraints. The adaptability of gambling illustrates its resilience and the deep-seated human fascination with chance, risk, and reward. Gambling also influenced moral and philosophical thought. Thinkers of the period debated the ethical implications of risk, chance, and fortune. Some considered gambling a distraction from virtuous life, encouraging covetousness and dependence on luck rather than effort. Others acknowledged its role in developing strategic thinking, psychological acuity, and social awareness. Philosophical discussions sometimes linked gambling to broader questions of fate, divine providence, and human agency, reflecting medieval engagement with uncertainty not only in leisure but in existential understanding. Economic consequences continued to ripple through communities. Significant losses affected families, trade, and local markets. Municipal authorities attempted to mitigate these effects through regulation, taxation, and oversight. However, enforcement was inconsistent, as the cultural, social, and psychological dimensions of gambling ensured its persistence. Small-scale games, clandestine play, and local rituals allowed gambling to survive even under legal or moral restriction, reinforcing the idea that it was a pervasive, adaptive, and enduring aspect of life. By the late Middle Ages, the accumulation of gambling practices had produced a layered and enduring cultural framework. Games were not isolated activities, but integrated into the rhythms of work, leisure, religion, and social interaction. The proliferation of printed materials, including manuals and guides, allowed knowledge of games to spread across regions, standardizing practices while facilitating innovation. Superstitions, rituals, and symbolic interpretations persisted, merging with strategies, social negotiation, and moral reflection. Gambling became simultaneously a social glue, a psychological outlet, and a moral challenge, reflecting the complexity of medieval human experience. Stories from this period highlight the diversity of experiences with gambling. Nobles lost lands, soldiers risked pay, merchants jeopardized livelihoods, and peasants wagered tools and sustenance. Yet the act of playing persisted, illustrating both human resilience and the deep psychological appeal of chance. Legends grew around individuals whose fortunes rose or fell dramatically through gambling. Tales of cleverness, audacity, and misfortune became part of the oral and written record, reinforcing social lessons about risk, prudence, and human nature. The epidemic was not merely statistical but deeply experiential, shaping personal identities, community cohesion, and cultural imagination. The story of gambling in medieval Europe deepens as one considers its role not only in daily life but also in the broader cultural, social, and economic systems that defined the period. What begins as a seemingly simple pastime, rolling dice, drawing cards, or betting coins, expands into a phenomenon that touches nearly every facet of medieval existence, from social hierarchy to ritual practice, from moral philosophy to economic consequence. In rural communities, gambling often functioned as a subtle mechanism for maintaining social cohesion. While the immediate appeal of chance and the excitement of play were evident, these games also reinforced local hierarchies and mediated relationships. A man who consistently won, for instance, might be subtly elevated in status, seen as clever, strategic, or fortunate. Conversely, a man who frequently lost could face quiet disapproval or gentle mockery, not necessarily in public, but in everyday social interactions. These judgments, though informal, shaped reputations and influenced how people were perceived in matters of trust, marriage, and communal responsibility. Even children, observing these interactions, absorbed the lessons, learning both the mechanics of the games and the social codes surrounding them. In this sense, gambling acted as an informal educational tool, transmitting knowledge, values, and social norms alongside entertainment. The urban context added a layer of complexity. Cities with the dense populations and intricate social networks provided a fertile ground for gambling to thrive. In towns like Florence, Venice, Paris, London, and Bruges, inns, taverns, and public squares served as spaces where people of different social classes could interact over games of chance. The tavern keeper played a unique role as both observer and mediator, ensuring disputes did not escalate while benefiting from the patronage gambling attracted. Urban gambling was often more sophisticated than its rural counterpart. Cards, when available, introduced symbolic systems, strategic considerations, and rules that were standardized through manuals and oral transmission. Dice games also evolved, with variations that increased complexity, stakes, and the psychological engagement of participants. Noble courts elevated gambling to an art form intertwined with social performance. The stakes were rarely trivial gold coins, fine fabrics, horses, land, and even political favors were wagered. These games were highly ritualized, with etiquette, observation, and interpretation forming an integral part of play. A successful gambler in this context was admired not only for luck but for skill, cunning, and the ability to read opponents. Social observers, other nobles, visitors, or chroniclers, interpreted behavior and outcomes as indicators of character, judgment, and intelligence. Gambling became a form of social signaling, a lens through which status, prudence, and audacity could be assessed without open confrontation. Failure, meanwhile, could signal imprudence, arrogance, or misjudgment, subtly influencing alliances, marriages, and political maneuvers. Religion provided a counterpoint to these practices, consistently framing gambling as a moral concern. Clerics and church councils issued repeated admonitions, warning that reliance on chance fostered greed, idleness, and moral weakness. Monasteries attempted to regulate games within their walls, sometimes forbidding them entirely, though historical records indicate occasional violations. The tension between official disapproval and personal indulgence underscores the deep-rooted human attraction to chance. Religious critiques were not only moral, but also practical. Excessive gambling could threaten families, destabilize communities, and divert attention from work or piety. Yet, the persistence of gambling, even within religious contexts, demonstrates its psychological and cultural power. Superstition and ritual were integral to the experience. Dice, cards, and other objects were often imbued with meaning beyond their physical properties. Players carried charms, recited prayers, or performed gestures thought to influence outcomes. Certain numbers, combinations, or card suits were considered auspicious or unlucky. These rituals served multiple purposes. They provided a sense of control, reinforced shared cultural beliefs, and added dramatic tension to the act of play. In many ways, the ritualization of gambling mirrored broader medieval engagements with fate, providence, and the unpredictable forces governing life. Military life, with its constant uncertainty, further amplified the role of gambling. Soldiers faced perilous circumstances, long marches, scarce supplies, and the looming threat of combat. Dice and card games offered psychological relief, fostering camaraderie, alleviating boredom, and providing structured encounters with risk. Soldiers' engagement with gambling often mirrored social hierarchies. Officers might regulate games to maintain discipline, while enlisted men relied on them for morale and social negotiation. Chronicles and archaeological finds, dice, carved game pieces, and records of disputes attest to the prevalence of gambling even amidst war. The persistence of these practices illustrates how deeply ingrained the desire to engage with chance was, transcending both class and circumstance. The economic dimensions of gambling were substantial. On an individual level, winnings and losses could dramatically affect financial stability. Merchants who lost capital risked defaulting on debts, disrupting trade networks and affecting employees or suppliers. Laborers and peasants could jeopardize food, tools, or household resources. On a community level, municipal authorities often sought to regulate gambling, issuing licenses, imposing fines, or setting limits on stakes. Despite such interventions, the practice persisted, highlighting the adaptability of gambling culture and the enduring human attraction to risk and reward. The interplay between regulation, enforcement, and cultural persistence provides insight into medieval society's attempts to manage behavior while accommodating deeply rooted social practices. Storytelling, literature, and visual art were deeply influenced by gambling. Chroniclers documented episodes of fortune and misfortune, weaving them into moral, instructive, or entertaining narratives. Illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and paintings often depicted dice games, card play, or other forms of gambling. These representations served multiple functions, recording social practices, illustrating moral lessons, and reflecting cultural values. Stories of gamblers who achieved extraordinary fortune or suffered ruin became part of communal memory, reinforcing lessons about prudence, audacity, and human folly. Art and literature thus acted as cultural mirrors, reflecting both the pleasures and perils of engaging with chance. Regional variations further enriched the landscape of gambling. Northern Europe favored dice games for their simplicity, portability, and accessibility, while Southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain, embraced card games, which allowed for symbolic interpretation, strategic play, and social display. Festivals, market days, and religious holidays often provided the socially acceptable context for public play, while informal gatherings allowed for more discreet gaming. These differences reflect both environmental and cultural factors, demonstrating how gambling adapted to local conditions while maintaining universal appeal. The moral and philosophical implications of gambling were debated by thinkers of the period. Some viewed games of chance as inherently dangerous, fostering dependency on luck rather than skill or labor. Others acknowledged gambling's potential to cultivate strategic thinking, social awareness, and psychological resilience. These debates often connected gambling to broader inquiries about fate, divine providence, and human agency. By engaging with uncertainty in a controlled environment, individuals could confront risk, learn about themselves, and test their capacity for judgment, providing a microcosm of the uncertainties of life itself. Superstition continued to play a central role in daily practice. Players interpreted patterns, performed gestures, or carried talismans, integrating belief into the mechanics of play. These rituals reinforced social cohesion, provided shared frameworks for understanding success and failure, and added layers of psychological engagement. Over time, these beliefs became codified into local customs, influencing gameplay, dispute resolution, and social perception. In some regions, entire networks of players adhered to specific superstitions or rituals, creating a cultural ecosystem around chance. Gambling also shaped personal identities and life trajectories. Individuals who excelled at games could gain temporary or long-lasting prestige, influence, or wealth. Repeated losses could impose social or economic penalties, reinforcing cautionary narratives. Tales of gamblers who won or lost spectacularly circulated widely, becoming part of the cultural memory. These stories, often recorded by chroniclers, poets, or local storytellers, reinforced the social, moral, and psychological lessons associated with chance. Gambling, in this sense, became both a practice and a story, simultaneously lived and remembered. Economic, social, and psychological dynamics intersected in complex ways. Urban spaces, military camps, noble courts, and rural households all provided distinct contexts for gambling, each with unique stakes, rules, and consequences. Across Europe, regulation attempted to constrain behavior, yet cultural persistence, human desire for excitement, and psychological needs ensured gambling's endurance. The practice was both adaptive and resilient, reflecting fundamental aspects of human engagement with uncertainty, reward, and risk. Gambling in medieval Europe, as the historical record shows, was far more than an occasional diversion. It was a phenomenon deeply embedded in the social, economic, psychological, and cultural fabric of the time. To fully understand the scope and impact of this epidemic, one must consider the breadth of human experience it touched, the various forms it took across regions, and the enduring significance it held across classes, occupations, and generations. In rural villages, gambling was often inseparable from communal life. The rhythm of agrarian work, sowing, tending, and harvesting, structured the days and seasons, but once labor ended, social life began to flourish. Villagers gathered around hearths or in communal halls, drawing out dice or hand-carved sticks, rolling and betting over simple games that required more strategy and intuition than complex rules. These games were small-scale yet socially meaningful. A peasant who consistently won might subtly elevate his status among neighbors, demonstrating cleverness, patience, or psychological insight. A consistent loser could suffer gentle teasing or social marginalization. Children absorbed these lessons early, observing the games, learning strategies, and internalizing social norms associated with luck, fairness, and competition. In this way, gambling functioned as both entertainment and informal education, transmitting cultural knowledge alongside amusement. Urban centers, with their dense populations and varied social strata, offered a more complex stage for gambling. Cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, London, and Bruges were hubs of trade, wealth, and social interaction, providing abundant opportunities for games of chance. Taverns and inns became central to this culture, offering warmth, food, and the cover of semi-public space for gambling. Tavern owners often facilitated games, seeing increased patronage and revenue as direct benefits. Dice games thrived in these spaces, and as cards became more prevalent, games of greater complexity and strategic depth appeared. Cards introduced symbolic imagery, social nuance, and interpretive layers, allowing players to engage not only with numerical chance, but with cultural meaning, artistic symbolism, and psychological maneuvering. Gambling in urban spaces thus served multiple functions: entertainment, socialization, skill demonstration, and, in some cases, subtle social manipulation. In noble courts, gambling assumed a ritualized and highly formalized character. Nobles engaged in games as both leisure and social performance, often wagering items of significant value, such as coins, jewelry, land, or political favors. These games were carefully observed by peers, serving as a lens through which character, prudence, and strategic thinking were evaluated. Victory demonstrated intelligence, daring, or insight, while failure suggested recklessness or poor judgment. In some cases, a single game could influence alliances, marriages, or political maneuvering. Cards, with their intricate designs and symbolic figures, enhanced the sophistication of these games, allowing players to interpret meaning and signal understanding beyond mere chance. Noble gambling was thus both entertainment and social calibration, reinforcing hierarchy while allowing for controlled displays of ingenuity or audacity. Religion provided a consistent counterpoint, framing gambling as a moral issue. Church authorities issued repeated admonitions, linking games of chance to idleness, covetousness, and potential familial or social instability. Monasteries sought to prohibit gambling among their members, sometimes imposing strict penalties, though records indicate occasional indulgence by clerics. Religious critiques emphasized moderation, moral vigilance, and the spiritual dangers of overindulgence. Yet, the allure of chance was so compelling that even the devout occasionally participated, illustrating the persistent psychological and cultural appeal of gambling despite moral instruction. Superstition and ritual were central to the practice. Dice, cards, and other gaming objects were often thought to possess inherent luck or mystical properties. Players carried charms, recited prayers, or engaged in gestures designed to influence outcomes. Numbers, combinations, or card suits were imbued with fortune or misfortune, transforming gameplay into a culturally rich ritual act. These practices reflected medieval views of fate, divine influence, and the interplay between human action and cosmic uncertainty. The rituals enhanced engagement, provided psychological comfort, and reinforced cultural cohesion, creating a shared framework for understanding success, failure, and the unpredictable nature of chance. Military life further illustrates the importance of gambling in medieval society. Soldiers faced extreme uncertainty, the threat of injury, scarcity of provisions, and unpredictable campaigns. Games offered structured interaction with risk, providing entertainment, morale, and psychological relief. Dice and card games were common in camps, where soldiers could engage in competition and camaraderie. Officers sometimes regulated play to maintain discipline, reflecting the delicate balance between human diversion and military necessity. Surviving artifacts, dice, carved tokens, and written accounts demonstrate the persistence and significance of gambling, even under the harshest conditions, highlighting its adaptability and centrality in human life. Economically, gambling had ripple effects beyond the individual. A merchant who lost capital might fail to meet obligations to suppliers or employees, disrupting local markets. A peasant who lost earnings risked food insecurity or the inability to pay rent or taxes. Municipal authorities attempted regulation through taxation, licensing, or limitation of stakes, though enforcement often failed to suppress widespread participation. Despite legal and moral oversight, gambling persisted because it fulfilled psychological, social, and cultural needs. It served as a structured interaction with risk, a tool for social cohesion, and a source of entertainment, providing rewards beyond material gain. Cultural expressions of gambling were ubiquitous. Chroniclers documented extraordinary wins, devastating losses, and clever strategies, embedding these stories into moral, instructive, and entertaining narratives. Illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and paintings depicted games of chance, illustrating both leisure and caution. Legends of gamblers who achieved remarkable fortune or suffered catastrophic ruin became part of communal memory, reinforcing lessons about prudence, luck, and audacity. Gambling thus became a vehicle for storytelling, preserving and transmitting social values while reflecting human engagement with chance. Regional variations shaped the practice and perception of gambling. Northern Europe favored dice games for their portability, simplicity, and accessibility. Southern Europe embraced card games, offering symbolic depth, strategic complexity, and social prestige. Festivals, market days, and religious observances provided opportunities for sanctioned public play, while private gatherings allowed discreet continuation. This adaptability ensured the persistence of gambling across diverse environmental, cultural, and economic contexts. Its endurance demonstrates the universality of human fascination with chance, risk, and reward, transcending class, occupation, and geography. Philosophical and moral discussions surrounding gambling reflected its significance. Some thinkers condemned games of chance as inherently dangerous, fostering dependence on luck rather than effort, encouraging vice, and distracting from virtuous life. Others acknowledged that gambling could cultivate strategic thinking, social skills, and psychological resilience. Debates linked games of chance to broader questions of fate, providence, and human agency. Engaging in gambling offered a structured simulation of risk, allowing individuals to confront uncertainty, test judgment, and navigate social interaction, reflecting the complexities of human existence within a medieval framework. Psychologically, gambling provided excitement, engagement, and suspense. It offered structured outlets for competition, risk, and reward, while also fostering social bonds and facilitating negotiation of hierarchy. Superstition and ritual enhanced the experience, offering a sense of control over uncertain outcomes and reinforcing shared cultural frameworks. Whether in rural cottages, urban taverns, noble courts, or military camps, gambling satisfied fundamental human needs for stimulation, interaction, and structured engagement with unpredictability. Performative aspects of gambling were equally significant. Traveling entertainers incorporated games into their acts, providing instruction, amusement, and spectacle. Spectators learned strategies, observed behavior, and engaged vicariously with risk, while players demonstrated skill, composure, and psychological insight. Festivals, fairs, and market days served as public stages for gambling, blending entertainment, social interaction, and moral instruction. This performative dimension reinforced the integration of gambling into daily life, creating shared experiences that strengthened social cohesion and cultural memory. The persistence of gambling underscores its adaptability and significance. Despite repeated attempts at regulation, moral condemnation, and legal restriction, games of chance remained central to medieval life. They evolved in form, strategy, and symbolism, reflecting social, economic, and cultural conditions while retaining the fundamental appeal of risk and reward. From simple rural dice games to elaborate card competitions in noble courts, gambling shaped social structures, economic interactions, psychological experiences, and cultural expression. Its endurance illustrates the universality of human engagement with uncertainty, the pleasure of risk, and the complex interplay between luck, skill, and social meaning. As the medieval period progressed, the gambling epidemic in Europe continued to grow in complexity, sophistication, and social significance. What had begun as small-scale rural pastimes evolved into highly structured activities embedded deeply within urban, noble, and even military life. Gambling became a mirror reflecting human behavior, societal hierarchies, economic realities, and cultural beliefs, revealing much about medieval life beyond mere diversion. In rural communities, the integration of gambling into daily life was remarkably adaptive. Villagers engaged in games of dice or rudimentary betting to pass time, build social cohesion, and navigate interpersonal dynamics. These activities were often tied to seasonal rhythms. After harvests, festivals, or during long winters, gambling provided entertainment and distraction, but also subtly enforced social norms. Winning or losing carried not only material consequences but social ones. A peasant who consistently demonstrated cleverness or skill could gain respect and influence within the village, while those who lost frequently might be gently teased or excluded from certain communal interactions. Children learned by observation, absorbing not only the mechanics of games, but the subtle moral and social lessons associated with them. Gambling thus functioned as both recreation and informal education, transmitting behavioral expectations, social cues, and ethical frameworks alongside the thrill of play. The urban experience of gambling was more public, diverse, and economically intertwined. Cities such as Paris, Florence, Venice, and London had dense populations, intricate social networks, and vibrant economic activity. Taverns, inns, and public halls became the loci of gambling culture, offering semi-public spaces where citizens could engage in games without immediate repercussion. Tavern owners played an essential role as facilitators, ensuring disputes were managed while profiting from increased patronage. Dice games, card games, and more elaborate forms of wagering flourished, each with unique rules, customs, and social interpretations. Cards, when introduced, added layers of symbolic meaning and strategy. Nobles and merchants alike engaged with these games, interpreting outcomes not only for financial gain, but as a measure of psychological insight, composure, and strategic thinking. Gambling became an arena in which urban identity, status, and reputation were continuously negotiated and displayed. Noble courts took gambling to a level of ritualized sophistication, intertwining leisure, social performance, and political calculation. Wagers often involved significant stakes, including coins, jewels, land, or influence over political or social outcomes. The act of playing was carefully observed by peers. Victory could demonstrate prudence, intelligence, or audacity, while failure might suggest recklessness or lack of foresight. These games were more than entertainment. They were mechanisms for assessing and asserting social hierarchy. Cards, with intricate designs, allegorical figures, and symbolic narratives, enhanced the strategic and performative aspects of play. Skillful players could signal understanding and influence, asserting subtle forms of social power. The ability to navigate games effectively became a valued attribute, and gambling itself emerged as a marker of sophistication, intelligence, and composure. The role of religion in regulating and framing gambling was complex and multifaceted. Clerics issued repeated admonitions, warning that games of chance encouraged greed, idleness, and distraction from spiritual duties. Monastic orders attempted to restrict or forbid gambling among members, sometimes with strict penalties. Despite these prohibitions, the persistent allure of chance ensured that games continued even within religious contexts. In some cases, minor games were tolerated as occasional leisure, reflecting an implicit understanding of the human desire to engage with uncertainty. The tension between moral instruction and human behavior underscores the pervasive psychological and cultural draw of gambling, illustrating its integration into daily life despite formal condemnation. Superstition and ritual remained central to gambling practice. Players carried charms, recited prayers, or performed specific gestures to influence outcomes. Dice, cards, and other objects were imbued with mystical significance, and certain numbers or combinations were considered lucky or unlucky. These rituals provided structure to chance, creating shared cultural frameworks for interpreting outcomes. They also offered psychological comfort, reinforcing participants' sense of agency in an unpredictable world. In some regions, entire networks of players adhered to specific superstitions and practices, integrating belief into strategy and social interaction. Gambling became not merely a contest of skill or luck, but a culturally rich practice intertwined with medieval understandings of fate, providence, and human agency. Military life illustrates yet another dimension of the gambling epidemic. Soldiers confronted extreme uncertainty daily, the threat of injury or death, unpredictable supply lines, and the chaos of campaign life. Dice and card games offered structured forms of risk, entertainment, and psychological relief. Games also reinforced social cohesion within units, fostering camaraderie and trust. Officers sometimes monitored or restricted play to maintain discipline, highlighting the delicate balance between recreation and order. Archaeological finds, including carved dice, game tokens, and references in military chronicles, attest to the prevalence of gambling in martial contexts. These activities helped soldiers manage anxiety, navigate social hierarchies, and maintain morale, demonstrating gambling's adaptability to the harshest environments. The economic impact of gambling extended well beyond individual players. Losses could destabilize families, merchants, and local economies. A merchant who lost a significant sum might be unable to settle debts, disrupting trade networks and impacting employees and suppliers. Laborers and peasants could risk food security or the ability to pay taxes or rent. Municipal authorities attempted regulation through licensing, fines, and stake limits, yet enforcement was often inconsistent. Despite these efforts, gambling persisted because it fulfilled psychological, social, and cultural needs that regulation alone could not satisfy. The interplay between economic risk, social interaction, and psychological engagement made gambling a central, enduring aspect of medieval life. Cultural expressions of gambling were pervasive and influential. Chroniclers documented extraordinary wins, spectacular losses, and clever strategies, embedding these stories into moral, instructive, and entertaining narratives. Tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and paintings depicted games of chance, portraying leisure, morality, and social dynamics. Legends of gamblers who achieved remarkable fortune or suffered catastrophic ruin became part of communal memory, reinforcing social and ethical lessons about prudence, audacity, and the human relationship with chance. Gambling thus became both an activity and a narrative, lived experience and cultural artifact, shaping identity, reputation, and collective memory. Regional variation shaped the practice and perception of gambling. Northern Europe favored dice games, prized for simplicity, portability, and accessibility, while Southern Europe embraced card games, offering symbolic richness, strategic depth, and social prestige. Public occasions, festivals, market days, and religious observances provided opportunities for sanctioned play, while private gatherings allowed for discreet continuation. Adaptability ensured the persistence of gambling across diverse social, cultural, and geographic contexts. Its endurance demonstrates the universality of human fascination with risk, uncertainty, and reward, transcending social class, occupation, and environment. Philosophical and moral debates about gambling reflect its significance beyond mere recreation. Some thinkers condemned games of chance as fostering dependence on luck, encouraging vice, and distracting from virtuous labor. Others acknowledged gambling's potential to develop strategic thinking, psychological resilience, and social awareness. These discussions connected games of chance to broader inquiries about fate, providence, and human agency. By engaging with risk in structured environments, individuals confronted uncertainty, tested judgment, and navigated complex social interactions. Gambling became both a moral arena and a psychological laboratory, reflecting medieval society's nuanced understanding of chance and consequence. Psychologically, gambling provided excitement, suspense, and engagement. It offered structured competition, social connection, and an opportunity to exercise strategic skill. Rituals, superstitions, and symbolic interpretations enhanced the experience, providing a sense of control over unpredictable outcomes. Across rural cottages, urban taverns, noble courts, and military encampments, gambling satisfied fundamental human desires: stimulation, interaction, and engagement with uncertainty. The persistence of these practices highlights both the adaptability of human culture and the universal appeal of games of chance. The performative dimension of gambling further cemented its cultural significance. Traveling entertainers incorporated games into their acts, drawing crowds and teaching strategies. Spectators observed, learned, and engaged vicariously with risk, while participants demonstrated skill, composure, and psychological acuity. Festivals, fairs, and markets became stages for public gambling, blending entertainment, social negotiation, and moral instruction. In these contexts, gambling was simultaneously spectacle, education, and social bonding, reinforcing its centrality in medieval life. The endurance of gambling across centuries demonstrates its deep integration into medieval European culture. Despite repeated attempts at regulation, moral censure, and legal restrictions, games of chance continued to thrive. They evolved in form, strategy, and symbolism, adapting to social, economic, and cultural shifts while retaining the essential appeal of risk and reward. From humble rural dice games to intricate card competitions in noble courts, gambling shaped social interaction, economic decisions, psychological experience, and cultural expression. It was both an entertainment and a lens through which medieval Europeans understood chance, fortune, and human agency, reflecting a civilization simultaneously preoccupied with control and fascinated by the unpredictable. The phenomenon of gambling in medieval Europe was not merely a pastime or casual indulgence. It was a cultural force that shaped communities, personal identities, social hierarchies, and even economic systems. To understand the depth and breadth of the gambling epidemic, one must consider how it influenced daily life, morality, social dynamics, and broader cultural expressions. Its pervasiveness, adaptability, and resilience illustrate the ways in which humans have always been drawn to uncertainty, risk, and the possibility of reward. In the countryside, gambling was deeply intertwined with communal life and seasonal cycles. Villagers' work was dictated by the demands of agriculture, sowing, harvesting, tending livestock, and managing limited resources. After labor-intensive days, particularly following harvests or long winter nights, gambling provided an avenue for leisure, socialization, and emotional release. Simple dice games, hand-carved sticks, or rudimentary forms of betting were common, accessible to most households. These games were not trivial. A player's skill or luck could affect reputation, influence, and social interactions. Success elevated status subtly, signaling intelligence, caution, or psychological acumen, while repeated losses might lead to gentle ridicule or social caution. Even children observed these games, absorbing social rules, etiquette, and strategies. In this way, gambling served as informal education, transmitting cultural knowledge alongside entertainment. Rural gambling was also tied to celebration and ritual. Seasonal festivals, harvest feasts, and religious holidays provided sanctioned opportunities for communal play. These gatherings were social theaters where reputation, skill, and luck were publicly displayed, and where communal bonds were reinforced. Villagers participated in shared rituals, from gestures performed before rolling dice to recitations or invocations meant to ensure fortune. Superstition was inseparable from gameplay. Players carried talismans, interpreted omens, and followed local customs that imbued games with layers of meaning. Such practices reflected medieval understandings of fate, providence, and human interaction with chance. Urban centers presented a more complex and public environment for gambling. Cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, London, and Bruges offered dense populations, economic diversity, and vibrant social networks. Taverns, inns, and marketplaces became the epicenters of gambling culture. Here, dice, cards, and other forms of games flourished, often in semi-public settings where participants could engage freely while observers watched, learned, and sometimes joined. Urban gambling was highly social and performative, involving negotiation of status, demonstration of skill, and public display of psychological insight. Tavern owners benefited economically, ensuring fair play and managing disputes while profiting from increased patronage. Cards, particularly in Southern Europe, introduced symbolic complexity, allowing players to engage with imagery, allegory, and strategy, transforming play into a multidimensional experience that combined entertainment with social signaling. Noble courts elevated gambling to ritualized and highly codified forms. Wagers were substantial, including coins, jewelry, horses, or even influence over political or social outcomes. Success and failure carried social weight. A victorious noble demonstrated prudence, intelligence, and audacity, while repeated losses could suggest recklessness or poor judgment. Cards, when used, allowed for symbolic interpretation and strategic sophistication, providing an arena in which social and psychological skill was as important as chance. Gambling thus functioned as social calibrations, an environment where reputation, hierarchy, and personal attributes were continuously assessed and negotiated. These activities were performed with decorum, observation, and deliberate ritual, transforming chance into a medium of status display and social maneuvering. Religion consistently framed gambling as a moral concern. Clerics warned that games of chance fostered idleness, greed, and distraction from spiritual duties. Monastic orders attempted to prohibit gambling, sometimes imposing penalties or enforcing strict oversight. Yet records indicate that even devout individuals occasionally engaged in games, reflecting the deep psychological and social draw of gambling. Religious critiques often emphasized moderation, self-control, and moral vigilance, but also occasionally allowed minor games under controlled circumstances. This dynamic illustrates the tension between human desire for engagement with chance and formal moral instruction, highlighting gambling's resilience and integration into everyday life. Superstition and ritual were central to the medieval gambling experience. Dice, cards, and other objects were often believed to carry mystical properties or luck. Players carried charms, recited prayers, or performed gestures meant to influence outcomes. Certain numbers, combinations, or cards were considered auspicious or unlucky, adding layers of cultural meaning to gameplay. These rituals serve to provide psychological comfort, reinforce social cohesion, and offer interpretive frameworks for understanding both success and failure. Over time, these superstitions became codified into local customs, producing regionally distinct practices that connected gambling to broader medieval beliefs about fortune, fate, and divine influence. Military life provides another lens through which the gambling epidemic can be examined. Soldiers, facing the constant unpredictability of combat, scarcity, and uncertainty, relied on dice and card games for diversion, psychological relief, and social cohesion. Games were often communal, reinforcing bonds and camaraderie within units. Officers sometimes monitored gambling to maintain discipline, reflecting the delicate balance between recreational engagement and the practical needs of military organization. Archaeological evidence, dice, carved tokens, and contemporary accounts demonstrates that gambling persisted even under the harshest conditions, providing soldiers with structured engagement with risk and chance in an otherwise dangerous environment. Economically, gambling had both micro and macro level consequences. Individuals risked earnings, tools, or provisions, while merchants risked capital that could affect employees, suppliers, and local trade networks. Losses could ripple through communities, causing temporary instability or forcing interventions from local authorities. Municipal governments sought to regulate gambling through licensing, fines, and restrictions on stakes, yet enforcement was often inconsistent. Despite these measures, gambling persisted because it fulfilled deep psychological, social, and cultural needs that regulation alone could not suppress. The practice intersected with economic realities, social negotiation, and cultural identity, embedding itself into the structural and experiential fabric of medieval life. Cultural expression further reinforced the significance of gambling. Chroniclers documented dramatic wins, crushing losses, and clever strategies, often embedding moral lessons, entertainment, and social commentary into their accounts. Tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and paintings depicted games of chance in both leisurely and instructive contexts. These representations reflected and reinforced cultural understandings of risk, prudence, fortune, and folly. Tales of gamblers who achieved extraordinary wealth or suffered ruin circulated widely, entering oral tradition and local lore, ensuring that gambling was not only an activity, but a narrative framework for understanding human behavior, social dynamics, and ethical choices. Regional variations contributed to the diversity of gambling practices. Northern Europe, with its preference for dice games, emphasized simplicity, portability, and accessibility. Southern Europe favored card games, which offered symbolic richness, strategic depth, and social prestige. Public celebrations, religious festivals, and market days allowed socially sanctioned gambling, while private gatherings permitted more discreet play. This adaptability ensured the survival and growth of gambling across social, cultural, and geographic boundaries, demonstrating the universality of human fascination with risk, uncertainty, and the thrill of potential reward. Philosophical and moral debates surrounding gambling highlight its broader implications. Critics condemned it as fostering dependency on luck, encouraging vice, and diverting attention from labor and virtue. Supporters, however, argued that gambling cultivated strategic thinking, social awareness, and psychological resilience. These discussions often tied gambling to considerations of fate, providence, and human agency. Engaging with games allowed individuals to confront uncertainty in controlled settings, develop judgment, and navigate complex social interactions. Gambling thus functioned as both moral and intellectual training, reflecting medieval society's engagement with unpredictability and the human condition. Psychologically, gambling offered excitement, engagement, and challenge. It provided structured risk, opportunities for competition, and social interaction. Superstitions, rituals, and symbolic interpretations enriched gameplay, offering meaning and a sense of control over uncertain outcomes. Across rural, urban, noble, and military contexts, gambling addressed fundamental human needs for stimulation, social connection, and engagement with unpredictability. Its resilience highlights both human adaptability and the enduring appeal of games of chance. The performative aspect of gambling further underscores its cultural centrality. Traveling entertainers incorporated games into performances, teaching strategy, engaging audiences, and creating spectacle. Festivals, fairs, and markets became public stages for gambling, blending entertainment, social negotiation, and moral instruction. Spectators learned from observation, participants demonstrated skill and composure, and communities collectively experienced tension, suspense, and resolution. These performative dimensions reinforced gambling's role as social glue, cultural practice, and psychological engagement. The endurance of gambling across the medieval period reflects its adaptability and integration into European life. Despite repeated moral, legal, and religious opposition, games of chance continued to evolve, spreading across classes, regions, and social contexts. They were transformed, adapted, and ritualized to fit local customs, social hierarchies, and cultural expectations. From rural dice games to strategic card play in noble courts, gambling shaped social structures, economic interactions, psychological experience, and cultural production. It was simultaneously a pastime, a moral challenge, a social instrument, and a cultural lens, illustrating the complex human engagement with risk, fortune, and skill. As the medieval gambling epidemic progressed into the later Middle Ages, it began to influence not only the familiar domains of social interaction, moral debate, and economic consequence, but also extended into less obvious arenas such as law, crime, literature, and even early notions of probability and strategy. By this stage, gambling had become so culturally pervasive that it could no longer be understood merely as a pastime. It had become a structural element of medieval life, woven into the rhythms of communities, economies, and human psychology. Legal responses to gambling offer a fascinating glimpse into how societies attempted to manage and control human behavior in the face of irresistible temptation. Across Europe, towns and cities implemented a variety of ordinances, taxes, and punitive measures aimed at regulating games of chance. Some jurisdictions sought to protect the economically vulnerable, limiting the stakes that could be wagered, while others targeted public order, punishing disruptive behavior associated with gambling. Records from Florence, for instance, indicate that tavern owners were sometimes required to pay fees for allowing dice games on their premises, and repeated violations could lead to fines or temporary closure. In England, municipal charters frequently banned gambling in public spaces, particularly on Sundays, linking the activity to idleness, moral corruption, and disruption of civic life. Yet despite such legal interventions, enforcement was inconsistent, and gamblers found ways to adapt. Underground gaming, clandestine card tables, and secret dice games allowed communities to continue playing while circumventing authorities. The cat and mouse dynamic between regulators and gamblers exemplifies the persistence of human desire for risk and reward, and the limitations of institutional power against culturally embedded behavior. Gambling also intersected with crime in complex ways. As stakes increased and wealth concentrated in urban centers, disputes over winnings or losses sometimes escalated into theft, assault, or fraud. Records from German and Italian city-states include numerous cases in which individuals were accused of cheating at dice or cards, stealing tokens, or attempting to manipulate outcomes through trickery. These incidents prompted both moral outrage and legal responses, illustrating the moral, social, and economic pressures that gambling exerted on communities. Even when games were intended purely as recreation, the potential for loss and dishonesty created tensions that rippled through families, guilds, and neighborhoods, demonstrating that gambling could have consequences far beyond the table. The relationship between gambling and literature is equally noteworthy. Stories, poems, and plays often incorporated games of chance as central motifs, using them to explore themes of fortune, risk, and human folly. In many narratives, gamblers were portrayed as archetypes, cunning tricksters, reckless fools, or audacious risk-takers whose fortunes rose and fell dramatically. These depictions served multiple purposes, entertaining audiences, imparting moral lessons, and reflecting societal preoccupations with luck and fortune. Chroniclers recorded gambling episodes involving both peasants and nobles, creating a literary archive that documented the psychological, social, and moral dimensions of games. Some stories even emphasized the paradoxical nature of gambling, the thrill of victory intertwined with the anxiety of potential loss, highlighting the human fascination with uncertainty and risk. An unexpected dimension of medieval gambling lies in the early development of probabilistic thinking and strategic play. While modern mathematics and probability theory were still centuries away from formal articulation, players often intuitively developed strategies to maximize their chances, particularly in dice games. Observing patterns, interpreting outcomes, and modifying techniques based on experience, players were engaging in rudimentary forms of statistical reasoning. Noble courts, where stakes were high and competition intense, sometimes saw players who combined observation, memory, and psychological insight to anticipate opponents' choices. These skills, though informal and unsystematic, represent an early form of applied strategic thinking, where understanding probability, chance, and human behavior directly affected outcomes. In this way, gambling was not purely recreational, it became an intellectual exercise, training observation, decision-making, and adaptability. Regional and cultural variation added further complexity to the epidemic. In Northern Europe, dice games predominated due to their accessibility and portability, often associated with peasant or urban working-class play. Southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain, increasingly favored card games that incorporated symbolic, artistic, and strategic elements. Festivals, religious celebrations, and market days provided socially sanctioned opportunities for gambling, while private clandestine play allowed for experimentation, adaptation, and innovation. Some regions developed specialized games unique to local culture, blending superstition, ritual, and skill in ways that reflected local values, beliefs, and social hierarchies. The adaptability of gambling ensured its survival and proliferation, allowing it to permeate multiple layers of society while maintaining cultural significance. Gambling's influence also extended to concepts of personal identity, reputation, and honor. For nobles and merchants, skillful play could enhance social prestige, demonstrating intelligence, composure, and psychological insight. In rural communities, success or failure at games subtly influenced social standing, shaping how individuals were perceived within the community. Among soldiers, gambling reinforced camaraderie and unit cohesion, providing structured competition and social negotiation under the pressures of military life. Even among the poor, who risked minimal material resources, gambling offered opportunities for temporary empowerment, psychological engagement, and social interaction. Across all classes, gambling became a lens through which personal character, ingenuity, and fortune were continuously assessed. The psychological dimensions of gambling in this period were multifaceted and profound. It offered excitement, suspense, and stimulation in contexts where monotony, danger, or labor dominated daily life. Structured risk provided engagement, challenge, and entertainment, while social and performative aspects added layers of meaning and evaluation. Superstitions, rituals, and symbolic practices enhanced the sense of control and significance, giving players the impression that outcomes were not purely random, but influenced by skill, preparation, or even divine favor. Gambling thus became a complex interplay of chance, strategy, psychology, and culture, a microcosm of human engagement with uncertainty. Moreover, gambling influenced social rituals, communication, and cultural transmission. In both rural and urban contexts, games served as vehicles for storytelling, moral instruction, and social negotiation. Traveling entertainers often incorporated gambling into performances, creating communal experiences that were both instructive and entertaining. Festivals and fairs offered public stages for gambling, where spectators observed, learned, and participated vicariously, while participants displayed skill, wit, and composure. These performative aspects reinforced gambling's role as a shared cultural practice, integrating leisure, social learning, and moral reflection. Interestingly, gambling also intersected with early economic innovation. In urban centers, the circulation of coins and the monetization of stakes created informal markets that both reflected and reinforced local economies. Losses and winnings shifted resources within communities, while taverns, inns, and gaming houses profited from hosting and facilitating play. In some cases, taxation of gambling or licensing fees became sources of municipal revenue, demonstrating the recognition of gambling as both a social reality and an economic force. The transactional nature of gambling created microeconomic dynamics that mirrored broader economic principles, linking individual behavior, risk, and resource distribution in tangible ways. The endurance and adaptability of gambling throughout medieval Europe highlight its profound resonance with human nature. Across centuries, regions, and social strata, people were drawn to the interplay of chance, skill, and social negotiation. Despite moral condemnation, legal restrictions, and religious disapproval, gambling persisted, evolving to meet changing cultural, economic, and social circumstances. From rural hearths to urban taverns, noble courts to military camps, gambling remained a central feature of daily life, shaping interactions, beliefs, and identities. By the late Middle Ages, gambling had developed into a complex, multi-dimensional cultural practice. It was not simply an activity for amusement. It was a social instrument, a moral test, a psychological exercise, an intellectual challenge, and an economic agent. The epidemic had woven itself into the fabric of medieval life, leaving traces in law, literature, superstition, ritual, and economic activity. Its influence on personal identity, community cohesion, and cultural expression cannot be overstated. Medieval Europeans understood both the allure and the dangers of gambling, and their engagement with chance became a defining aspect of social and cultural experience. As the gambling epidemic of medieval Europe matured, its influence extended into realms that were at once subtle and profound, reaching far beyond the dice tables and card games that most often defined it. By this stage, gambling was no longer simply an activity or diversion. It had become a lens through which people interpreted fortune, human behavior, social hierarchy, and even the unpredictable nature of life itself. It shaped interactions, informed decisions, and influenced cultural practices in ways that often went unnoticed but were deeply impactful. In rural areas, gambling continued to function as both social glue and a subtle arbiter of status. Villagers often gathered in the evenings, after long days of labor in the fields or forests, around small fires or within communal halls, rolling dice or wagering on rudimentary games of chance. These gatherings were more than entertainment. They were opportunities to demonstrate skill, wit, and composure. A peasant who consistently won could gain informal authority or respect among neighbors, signaling intelligence or perceptive skill. Conversely, repeated failure could generate gentle ridicule or social marginalization. These interactions reinforced social norms and hierarchies within tight-knit communities, while also providing avenues for negotiation, mediation, and informal learning. Children observing these gatherings absorbed cultural expectations, etiquette, and strategic thinking, ensuring the continuity of gambling culture across generations. Rural gambling was often intertwined with ritual and seasonal cycles. Festivals, harvest celebrations, and religious holidays provided socially sanctioned spaces for gambling. Communities incorporated games of chance into these larger social events, making play a shared cultural experience. Superstitions and small rituals were common. Players might carry charms, perform specific gestures, or recite short prayers before rolling dice or drawing cards. Numbers, combinations, or certain outcomes were often regarded as lucky or unlucky, adding layers of significance to what might otherwise appear to be simple games. These practices reflected medieval conceptions of fate, providence, and human interaction with forces beyond their control, demonstrating how gambling could be both entertainment and a culturally rich, quasi-spiritual activity. Urban gambling, in contrast, became more public, regulated, and economically intertwined. Cities such as Paris, Venice, Florence, and London were hubs of trade and population density, providing fertile ground for gambling culture. Taverns, inns, and marketplaces served as central venues where people could engage in games of chance, either openly or discreetly. Tavern owners frequently facilitated gaming, recognizing the economic advantage of attracting patrons who would purchase food, drink, and lodging. Dice games remained popular due to their simplicity and portability, but card games, especially in Southern Europe, introduced more complexity, strategy, and symbolic meaning. Cards allowed players to engage not only with numerical chance, but also with cultural, allegorical, and psychological dimensions. Urban gambling was simultaneously a social, performative, and economic activity, providing participants with opportunities to demonstrate skill, negotiate status, and interact with broader networks of social influence. In noble courts, gambling took on ritualized, ceremonial, and highly strategic forms. Wagers often involved significant wealth, property, or social influence. Success could enhance personal prestige, demonstrate intelligence and composure, and even influence alliances or political decisions. Failure, however, could have serious social consequences, marking a noble as reckless or imprudent. Games in these settings were carefully observed, with outcomes interpreted as indicators of character, judgment, and strategic acumen. Cards, with their complex imagery and allegorical significance, enhanced the sophistication of these games, blending entertainment, social signaling, and psychological insight. Gambling thus became a microcosm of courtly life, an arena in which fortune, strategy, and social negotiation intersected in highly visible ways. Religious institutions maintained a persistent yet nuanced critique of gambling. Clerics frequently condemned games of chance, warning that they fostered greed, idleness, and moral weakness. Monastic orders attempted to prohibit gambling among members, sometimes imposing strict penalties. However, historical evidence suggests that even devout individuals occasionally engaged in games, indicating the deep psychological and social appeal of chance. Religious critiques often emphasized moderation and moral vigilance, acknowledging human desire while discouraging excess. In some cases, minor gambling within controlled contexts was tolerated, reflecting the complex negotiation between moral instruction and human behavior. This dynamic illustrates how gambling was both culturally pervasive and morally contested, deeply embedded in medieval life despite formal censure. Superstition, ritual, and belief played critical roles in the medieval gambling experience. Players often carried charms, invoked prayers, or performed gestures to influence outcomes. Dice, cards, and other objects were sometimes imbued with mystical properties, and certain numbers, combinations, or sequences were considered lucky or unlucky. These practices provided players with psychological comfort, a sense of agency, and culturally shared frameworks for interpreting success and failure. Entire communities or networks of players often adhered to specific superstitions and rules, creating localized systems of meaning that integrated chance, skill, and belief. Gambling, in this sense, became a complex interaction of luck, psychology, and culture, reflecting medieval understanding of both fate and human capability. The role of gambling in military life was similarly complex. Soldiers, confronted with constant uncertainty, danger, and scarcity, relied on dice and card games for psychological relief, entertainment, and social cohesion. Games offered structured interaction with risk, creating spaces for camaraderie and negotiation of social hierarchy within units. Officers sometimes regulated or restricted play to maintain discipline, demonstrating the tension between human diversion and institutional order. Archaeological finds, including dice, carved tokens, and contemporary accounts, reveal that gambling persisted in camps, fortresses, and on campaign, illustrating its adaptability to extreme conditions and its significance for human morale and social bonds. Economically, gambling had far-reaching effects. Individual losses could destabilize households, while merchants who lost capital risked disrupting trade networks and affecting employees or suppliers. Municipal authorities attempted to regulate gambling through taxation, licensing, or limitations on stakes, but enforcement was inconsistent. Despite legal oversight, gambling persisted because it fulfilled deep psychological, social, and cultural needs. Games of chance influenced resource distribution, social interactions, and economic networks, demonstrating that gambling was more than entertainment. It was a mechanism by which individuals and communities engaged with risk, negotiation, and opportunity. The literary and artistic presence of gambling during this period further illustrates its cultural significance. Chroniclers, poets, and storytellers often recorded episodes of dramatic fortune and ruin, embedding moral lessons alongside entertainment. Tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and paintings frequently depicted dice games, card play, or other gambling activities, reflecting societal engagement with chance and risk. These artistic expressions served multiple purposes. They entertained, instructed, and preserved communal memory, demonstrating how gambling was woven into both lived experience and cultural representation. Tales of gamblers who achieved remarkable fortune or suffered catastrophic loss circulated widely, influencing social norms, behavioral expectations, and collective imagination. Regional variation in gambling practices highlights the adaptability and diversity of the epidemic. Northern Europe favored dice games, prized for simplicity, portability, and accessibility, often associated with peasant or working class play. Southern Europe increasingly favored card games, offering symbolic depth, strategic complexity, and social prestige. Public festivals, religious celebrations, and market days provided opportunities for socially acceptable play, while clandestine gatherings allowed more discreet or innovative forms of gambling. Games evolved to reflect local beliefs, superstitions, and social hierarchies, demonstrating how gambling integrated seamlessly into the cultural, economic, and psychological life of communities. Philosophical and moral debates surrounding gambling engaged scholars, clergy, and public thinkers. Some condemned it as morally corrupting, fostering reliance on luck rather than labor and distracting from virtuous pursuits. Others recognized its potential to cultivate strategic thinking, psychological resilience, and social intelligence. These discussions linked gambling to broader questions of fate, divine providence, and human agency. Engaging with games of chance allowed participants to confront uncertainty in a structured environment, exercise judgment, and navigate complex social dynamics, making gambling both a moral and intellectual endeavor. Psychologically, gambling provided both thrill and engagement. It created structured opportunities to experience suspense, risk, and reward, often within socially moderated environments. Rituals, superstitions, and symbolic interpretations enriched the experience, giving players a sense of control and meaning. Across rural, urban, noble, and military contexts, gambling addressed essential human needs for stimulation, interaction, and engagement with unpredictability. Its persistence demonstrates the enduring appeal of chance and the human fascination with fortune and risk. By the late medieval period, gambling had firmly established itself as a multi-dimensional phenomenon, influencing social norms, economic behavior, cultural expression, and personal identity. From peasant cottages to royal courts, from urban taverns to military encampments, it was simultaneously recreation, social instrument, moral challenge, and economic agent. Its enduring appeal lay in its ability to reflect and manipulate fortune, demonstrate skill and intelligence, negotiate social hierarchy, and provide psychological engagement with uncertainty. Gambling had evolved far beyond simple games of chance. It had become an integral feature of medieval European life, shaping human experience in profound and lasting ways. As we reach the closing chapter of the gambling epidemic in medieval Europe, it becomes clear that the phenomenon was far more than a series of isolated games or fleeting diversions. It was a pervasive force that influenced social structures, personal identity, economic behavior, cultural expression, and psychological engagement across centuries and regions. From the simple dice games played by peasants in rural cottages to the intricate card competitions of noble courts, gambling permeated every layer of medieval life. It provided entertainment, social cohesion, and ritualized challenge, while also serving as a measure of character, skill, and fortune. Rural communities relied on gambling to build bonds and reinforce social norms. Seasonal festivals, harvest gatherings, and communal evenings provided opportunities for villagers to engage in games that transmitted both entertainment and subtle lessons in strategy, risk, and social etiquette. Even children observed and learned, ensuring that gambling culture persisted across generations. These small-scale practices reflected broader cultural attitudes toward chance, superstition, and fate, blending amusement with social and psychological instruction. In urban centers, gambling became highly public, performative, and economically intertwined. Taverns, inns, and marketplaces functioned as hubs where individuals could demonstrate skill, negotiate status, and interact within complex social networks. Cards and dice offered both chance and strategy, while the economic stakes, however small or large, linked gambling to local commerce and social mobility. Urban gambling was a sophisticated blend of entertainment, social performance, and microeconomic activity, reflecting the dynamism and diversity of medieval city life. Among the nobility, gambling was ritualized and strategic, often serving as a subtle arena for political maneuvering, reputation management, and psychological display. Wagers could include substantial material wealth, social influence, or even political advantage. Cards and dice were not merely recreational tools, but instruments through which intelligence, audacity, and composure were assessed. Success and failure at these games had tangible consequences, reflecting the interplay of chance, skill, and social hierarchy that characterized noble life. Religion framed gambling as a moral concern, oscillating between condemnation and cautious tolerance. Clerics and monastic orders warned against greed, idleness, and distraction from spiritual duties, yet even devout individuals occasionally engaged in games of chance. Moral instruction often emphasized moderation, self-control, and awareness of the dangers of excess. Superstition and ritual augmented gameplay, imbuing it with symbolic meaning, psychological comfort, and culturally shared frameworks for interpreting success and failure. Military contexts revealed another dimension of gambling. Soldiers, facing constant uncertainty and danger, used games of chance to build morale, relieve stress, and reinforce camaraderie. Even in conditions of scarcity or extreme risk, gambling provided a structured outlet for engagement with chance and skill. Archaeological evidence, from dice to carved tokens, attests to its prevalence and enduring appeal across the most challenging environments. Economically, gambling influenced households, merchants, and municipalities. Losses could destabilize families, affect trade, and ripple through communities, while local authorities sought to regulate stakes, licenses, and public play. Despite legal interventions, gambling persisted because it met psychological, social, and cultural needs that regulations could not entirely suppress. Culturally, gambling shaped literature, art, and folklore. Chroniclers recorded wins, losses, and strategies, embedding moral and instructive lessons in narrative. Tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and paintings depicted dice and card games, reflecting the social and symbolic dimensions of play. Tales of fortune, cleverness, and folly became part of communal memory, reinforcing gambling's significance across generations. Regional variation ensured that gambling remained adaptable and persistent. Northern Europe favored dice, emphasizing simplicity and accessibility, while Southern Europe embraced symbolic and strategic card games. Festivals, religious holidays, and market days offered socially sanctioned play, while private or clandestine gatherings allowed experimentation, innovation, and the persistence of local traditions. Philosophically and psychologically, gambling engaged participants with risk, strategy, and human behavior. Critics decried reliance on luck and moral corruption, while supporters recognized the development of strategic thinking, social intelligence, and psychological resilience. Engaging with uncertainty in controlled environments provided lessons in judgment, patience, and risk management, making gambling both intellectually and emotionally significant. In summary, the gambling epidemic of medieval Europe was far more than an episodic indulgence. It shaped social hierarchies, reinforced community bonds, influenced economic patterns, and provided psychological engagement. From rural cottages to urban taverns, noble courts to military camps, gambling became a lens through which medieval Europeans understood chance, fortune, human behavior, and the delicate balance between skill and luck. It was simultaneously entertainment, moral challenge, cultural expression, and social instrument, leaving a legacy that offers modern audiences insight into the complexity, adaptability, and universality of human fascination with risk. Thank you for joining this exploration of the gambling epidemic in medieval Europe. I hope this calm journey through history has been both enlightening and relaxing. If you enjoyed this narrative, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating historical stories delivered in a calm, immersive style. Your support helps continue these explorations and brings the past to life in a way that soothes and educates.